I want you to take a second and just imagine a future, maybe 40 years from now.
Right.
But instead of, the usual sci-fi flying cars and utopian cities, I want you to picture a scenario where your standard of living and the standard of living for the next generation is actually dramatically lower than it is right now.
It's a bleak picture.
Yeah, exactly. You're working harder, but the economy around you is shrinking. The opportunities just, well, they aren't there.
And the really wild thing is the math on that trajectory is already written on the wall. I mean, this isn't some dystopian thought experiment. It's the mathematical reality mapped out by the Australian government's own economists.
Yeah, if you look at the Australian government's intergenerational reports, the contrast over the last 2 decades is just jarring.
It really is.
Back in 2002, the report projected that gross domestic product, or GDP per person, was going to grow by 90% over the next 40 years. But by 2023, that projection had plummeted to just 57% growth.
Right, which is a profound reduction in the expected standard of living for an entire nation.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, March 18th, 2026, a sweeping independent report has been released. It's titled Ambitious Australia, and it was led by Tesla chairwoman Robyn Denholm.
A very significant piece of policy architecture.
Absolutely. And we are going to unpack this strategic blueprint alongside a highly critical analytical piece from the conversation. Basically, we're looking at why Australia's research and development system is officially being classified as broken and what the proposed structural overhaul actually entails.
Because for decades, Australia has leaned really heavily into its reputation as the lucky country, a nation that could rely almost entirely on the incredible mineral and agricultural resources beneath its soil. But the Denholm report is this urgent systemic call to transition away from that reliance.
Right. It argues that Australia has to build a complex knowledge-based economy, shifting from exporting raw materials to exporting advanced ideas and technology.
Exactly. But before we explore the proposed overhaul, we really need to understand the diagnosis. Like, how did a nation that used to thrive on innovation lose its edge?
Yeah, because if we look back to, say, the Hawke-Keating era in the 1980s and 90s, public spending on science and innovation saw a massive boost. The fastest growing part of Australia's exports back then were high-value, complex, finished products. I mean, productivity growth was beating the OECD average.
It was a completely different landscape, and the structural shift that caused the decline we see today comes down to an economic concept called comparative advantage.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So the basic premise is that a country should specialize in producing the things it can generate with a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners.
Makes sense on paper.
Right. On paper, for a country with vast, easily accessible reserves of iron ore and coal, leaning into mining makes perfect logical sense.
But the sources outline a pretty fatal flaw in how pursuing that comparative advantage played out in reality.
Yeah, the flaw is that it essentially cannibalized other industries. In this really aggressive pursuit of resource exports, successive federal governments just allowed the mining sector to crowd out high-value manufacturing.
Wow.
As the economy grew increasingly dependent on digging things out of the ground, manufacturing as a share of GDP steadily declined. And here's the kicker. In most advanced economies, the manufacturing sector is the primary driver of commercial research and development.
Right, because when you lose the factories making complex goods,
You lose the laboratories and the engineering teams that are trying to improve those goods.
yeah, the numbers in these sources paint a very stark picture of that decline. Australia is currently ranked 105th out of 145 national economies for economic complexity.
Which is an incredible statistic for a wealthy nation.
Let's pause on that, actually,
Yeah.
because that term gets thrown around a lot. What does economic complexity actually measure in this context?
So, economic complexity essentially measures the knowledge intensity of an economy. If you export $1 million worth of raw iron ore, yes, that requires heavy machinery, but the product itself is simple.
It's just a rock, basically.
Exactly. The knowledge embedded in it is low. But if you export $1 million worth of pacemakers or quantum computing software, you are exporting thousands of hours of embedded, highly specialized human knowledge.
I see.
So ranking 105th means Australia's overwhelmingly exporting heavy, simple things and importing complex, knowledge-dense things.
That makes the employment statistics make a lot more sense then. The mining sector makes up roughly 10% of Australia's GDP, but it only employs 2% of the workforce.
Right.
Meanwhile, around 50% of the country's total export revenue comes from just selling natural resources and agriculture.
And those numbers translate directly to a stagnant innovation landscape. I mean, Australia's manufacturing share is now the lowest among developed OECD economies.
Wow, lowest in the OECD.
Lowest. And overall R&D spending hit just 1.69% of GDP in 2023-24. That's down from a peak of 2.24% back in 2008. And the thing is, when you stop funding the creation of new knowledge, your efficiency plateaus. Between 2010 and 2020, Australia recorded its weakest productivity growth in 6 decades.
It sounds to me like Australia is playing the role of the global economy's trust fund kid.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, like they've been living incredibly well off this vast inheritance of dirt and minerals. But because that trust fund pays out so consistently every quarter, the nation hasn't bothered to build a career or learn a new trade or adapt to a changing world.
That analogy captures the macroeconomic complacency perfectly, but the report identifies a secondary problem that is arguably worse than just complacency.
What was that?
Well, over time, the government's instinct to minimize risk has created a funding system that is basically paralyzed by caution and atomization.
The report describes the current system as a bureaucratic maze. What does that atomization actually look like for someone, trying to innovate in Australia today?
It looks like upward of 150 different Commonwealth grant programs for research and development.
150.
Yeah. And these programs are totally siloed. They have varying application processes, differing criteria, and very few of them actually fund the full cost of the research.
So they're just sprinkling money around.
Exactly. The government is essentially taking a limited pool of money and spreading it incredibly thin across thousands of disconnected activities. And they do this to avoid the political risk of picking winners and losers.
Which is a nightmare. I mean, if you are a startup founder trying to build a new business, you don't have the time or the capital to hire a team of consultants just to navigate a labyrinth of 150 different grants.
No, of course not.
You're spending 40% of your time filling out paperwork instead of coding or engineering. The system actively punishes the people trying to build that complex economy.
Which brings us to the structural antidote proposed by the Ambitious Australia report. If the diagnosis is a fragmented, overly complex system, the solution they're pitching is radical consolidation. The central recommendation is to collapse this sprawling mess of grants into 6 national innovation pillars.
And for you listening, those 6 proposed pillars are health and medical, agriculture and food, defense, environment and energy, resources, and technology.
Right. And the strategy is to anchor each pillar with a long-term national goal. The intention is to force concentration. Instead of funding every conceivable idea with a tiny drop of capital, the government would concentrate significant funding into the 6 areas where Australia actually has the foundational research to lead the world.
Okay, but I want to push back on this structural idea a bit.
Yeah.
Because the analysis from the conversation raises a very valid red flag here. And remember, we're just laying out what the sources say.
Absolutely. Let's hear it.
The Denholm report wants to create a National Innovation Council to oversee everything. And on top of that, they want to establish a National Strategy Advisory Council for every single one of those 6 pillars.
Right. The governance structure.
Yeah. Aren't we just replacing a maze of 150 grants with a brand new maze of bureaucrats? I mean, the Business Council of Australia pointed this out, suggesting Australia should instead look at the UK's catapult centre.
Catapult centers, yeah.
Which are localized, physical hubs where scientists and businesses actually work side by side, rather than just creating more advisory boards.
It's a really fair critique. The risk of bureaucratic bloat is definitely the primary vulnerability of this report. However, the blueprint defends these councils by tasking them with creating what they call National Strategic Initiatives, or NSIs.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, the councils aren't supposed to just sit around and write reports. They are supposed to build these NSIs to act as a single front door for innovation.
But what does a front door actually mean in practice? I mean, anyone can put up a sign that says front door. How does an NSI physically force a university researcher and a corporate CEO to stop working in silos and actually collaborate? We've heard buzzwords like synergy and collaboration from governments for decades.
Yeah, it's a good question. The mechanism here is funding conditionality.
Oh, holding the money hostage.
Basically, yes. Under the NSI model, a university or a startup wouldn't be able to just apply for a grant in isolation anymore. The NSI manages proof of concept schemes and public-private partnerships by requiring coalitions.
Interesting.
So to access the really significant capital pools dedicated to a specific pillar, say next generation solar tech, you have to apply as a united front. Researchers, industry partners, and scale-ups all working together on a specific high-impact challenge. It mandates teamwork by holding the purse strings.
Okay, so the councils are there to define the singular problem, and the NSI holds the money, only releasing it to teams that have bridged that gap between academia and industry.
Exactly.
Right, so restructuring the bureaucracy creates a better engine, but you need momentum to actually drive the economy forward. And the report visualizes this as the R&D and innovation flywheel.
The flywheel is a much better way to think about this than just a static engine. Think of pushing a massive boulder. The initial push is the hardest part. That is foundational research creating brand new knowledge. That knowledge then attracts private investment, which creates scaling businesses.
No.
And then those businesses generate revenue and global competitiveness, which then provides the gravity and the momentum to fund the next round of foundational research. The flywheel spins faster and faster, but you really need that immense initial push.
And that initial push is foundational, or what they call blue sky research. This is research that doesn't necessarily have an immediate, obvious commercial application right out of the gate.
Right, you're not building a product yet.
Yeah, and there is an incredible example in the sources regarding Australia's National Science Agency, the CSIR.
Oh, the CSIRO example is the perfect defense of blue sky research. So years ago, their researchers were doing this highly abstract work in radio astronomy.
Astronomy.
Yeah, they were trying to detect the faint, really complex mathematical signals emitted by exploding black holes.
Okay, looking for black holes doesn't exactly scream profitable business model.
Yeah.
I mean, how did that astronomical research actually translate into a commercial technology?
Well, to filter out the cosmic background noise and isolate the signals from those black holes, the researchers had to invent incredibly complex new mathematical equations for signal processing.
Just to clean up the data from space.
Exactly. Now, fast forward a few years, and tech companies all over the world were trying to figure out how to transmit data wirelessly indoors.
Oh, right.
But they kept failing because the signals kept bouncing off walls and creating massive interference. Well, the CSIRO researchers realized that the exact same equations they wrote to clean up black hole signals could be used to clean up indoor radio waves.
That is wild.
Yeah, that foundational math became the core technology behind modern Wi-Fi.
Wow. That is the ultimate proof that you can not only fund research that has an immediate quarterly business case, you have to fund discovery.
You really do.
And to protect that initial push of the flywheel, the report recommends reversing the decade-long decline in competitive grants for basic research. But they're also proposing a fundamental shift in how universities operate to support this, right?
Yes, this is a big one. Currently, Australian universities operate under this uniform requirement to maintain research breadth.
Meaning they have to do a little bit of everything.
Exactly. To be classified as a university, you have to conduct research across a wide variety of subjects, completely regardless of your actual strength.
That seems counterproductive.
The report thinks so too. They recommend abolishing that requirement entirely. They want to reform registrations so universities can specialize. Like, if a university is world-class in marine biology but terrible at robotics, they shouldn't be forced to fund a mediocre robotics department just to keep their university status.
Right, they should be allowed to build immense depth in their comparative advantage. So we secure the initial push of the flywheel by protecting blue sky thinkers and letting universities specialize. But once that boulder starts rolling, it needs the gravity of capital and investment to keep moving, to take those ideas out of the lab and into the global market.
And this is where the report takes aim at the R&D tax incentive, the RDTI. This is currently the primary lever the Australian government uses to support business innovation.
Okay.
The diagnosis here is that the vast majority of companies using the RDTI scheme are small to medium enterprises, and the data shows they are largely stagnant.
Wait, why is that happening? Are they just, using the tax break to subsidize their normal operations rather than actually trying to grow?
That is often exactly what's happening. The current incentive structure kind of just rewards the sheer act of spending on R&D rather than the commercialization or the scaling up of that R&D.
So it's just a tax loophole for regular expenses.
For some, yes. So the recommendation is to pivot the RDTI aggressively. They want to increase the threshold so the incentive focuses heavily on growth-focused scale-ups.
Meaning companies that have proven their concept and are actively trying to capture global market share.
Exactly. And they also propose a premium streamlined segment specifically for high-potential startups. This would offer them quarterly cash payments early in their life cycle, when liquidity is quite literally the difference between surviving and going bankrupt.
Okay, but government tax incentives are only a fraction of the capital puzzle. The report also scrutinizes private capital, and the expert panel zeroes in on a pool of money that is almost difficult to comprehend: Australia's superannuation funds.
Oh, this is fascinating. The compulsory superannuation system in Australia has aggregated a pool of retirement savings that is rarely matched anywhere else in the world. It is a multi-trillion-dollar national asset.
Trillions with a T.
Trillions. But currently, the regulatory mechanics of managing those massive asset pools make it incredibly difficult for super funds to actually invest in high-growth, early-stage Australian innovation.
Yeah, the sources specifically call out a regulation under the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, known as ASIC RG97, alongside some pretty strict performance tests. For those of us who aren't fund managers, what exactly are those rules doing to block investment into domestic startups?
Right. So ASIC RG97 heavily regulates the disclosure of fees and costs. And the concurrent performance tests actually penalize funds if their short-term returns dip below a certain benchmark.
Okay, so they have to show constant short-term wins.
Exactly. But venture capital, specifically Series B funding, which is the crucial injection of tens of millions of dollars a startup needs to build factories or scale globally, involves high management fees and highly illiquid assets.
The money is locked up.
The money is locked up for a decade while the company builds. Because super funds are terrified of failing those short-term performance tests or showing high fee structures to their members, they almost entirely avoid investing in domestic Series B rounds.
So let me get this straight. An Australian startup invents a brilliant new technology, they get their initial seed funding, but when it's time to build the actual manufacturing plant, the local retirement funds can't invest.
That's the reality.
So the startup has to go to Silicon Valley to get the money, and all the economic value, the patents, and the jobs just leave the country.
Precisely. That is the broken system in a nutshell. So the report is urging reforms to those performance tests and fee disclosures. They want to require super funds to at least give their members the option to allocate a portion of their retirement savings into high-growth Australian R&D firms.
Being a tiny fraction would be huge, right?
Mobilizing even 1 or 2% of that superannuation capital into the domestic scale-up ecosystem would completely transform the country's trajectory.
I mean, it is like having billions of dollars locked inside a high-yield vault that you aren't allowed to touch, while you are out on the street trying to scrounge together pennies to fund a revolutionary medical device.
It's absurd when you think about it.
The report is essentially arguing that Australia must unlock its own capital to fund its own innovators.
Right. But, you can have the perfect 6 pillars, specialized universities, and all the capital in the world unlocked. But if you do not have the human talent to execute the complex engineering or a market willing to actually buy the end product, that flywheel will stall completely.
Yeah, the human element is critical here.
Mm-hmm.
And the diagnosis on the workforce is just as alarming as the funding structures.
Very much so. The report highlights a severe and steady decline in domestic PhD enrollments. Australia is simply not training enough of its own citizens in critical areas.
Like what areas?
Well, the numbers for geoscientists, for example, are shockingly low, which is deeply ironic for a country whose entire current economy relies on digging up the earth.
That's wild.
They have been masking this gap by attracting international students, but the domestic talent pipeline is incredibly fragile.
And, you can't just tell people to stay in school longer when the cost of living is skyrocketing.
Except
The blueprint gets very specific about financial mechanisms here. They recommend lifting stipend rates for PhDs that specifically align with those 6 national innovation pillars. And even more practically, they suggest making part-time research scholarships completely tax-free.
which would be a huge help. The panel also recognizes that a complex economy requires more than just academic researchers. It requires commercial entrepreneurs. So they are calling for universities to design research programs with a mandatory industry
They're
focus.
about to look like.
It means industry-sponsored PhDs, joint appointments where a researcher is literally employed by both a university and a tech firm, and sabbaticals that encourage mobility between the lab and the boardroom.
I also noticed a very targeted focus on First Nations talent in the sources.
Hmm.
The report recommends establishing a network of First Nations pre-accelerators across the country.
Yes.
The goal there is to tap into diverse entrepreneurial talent and support early-stage innovation directly from those communities, ensuring that the transition to a knowledge economy doesn't, leave anyone behind.
So the talent is being trained and the ideas are being funded, but a business only survives if it has customers.
Right.
And this brings the report to a major historical failure regarding the biggest customer in the country, the Australian government itself.
The sources take us all the way back to a pretty stark warning from Prime Minister Bob Hawke in 1990.
Yeah, 36 years ago.
He stated clearly that Australia must reduce its reliance on imported technology and borrowed research. But fast forward to today, and the Denholm report notes, there is still this pervasive risk-averse mentality within government departments that it is just safer to purchase proven innovations from overseas.
The report argues that this procurement mentality creates massive sovereign risk and guarantees a bleak economic future. The government absolutely must lead by example to create a domestic market. So the recommendation is to install an if not, why not mandate into core government procurement policies.
How does an if not, why not rule actually function? Like when a government department needs to buy new software or defense equipment, what changes?
It reverses the burden of proof. The default position must be purchasing Australian-developed R&D.
Oh, I see.
If a government department wants to award a contract to a foreign tech giant instead, they have to explicitly and publicly justify why the Australian solution was inadequate.
That's a huge shift.
It is. The government possesses immense purchasing power, and it needs to use that power to provide the crucial first major contracts that smaller domestic R&D firms need to prove their viability.
Now, beyond just buying things, the government also employs thousands of its own researchers. How does the report plan to wrangle the various state-run research arms?
Well, Australia currently operates 16 separate publicly funded research agencies like the CSIRO we talked about, and 15 different rural research and development corporations known as RDCs.
So 31 total entities.
Right. And the recommendation is to forcefully align the mandates of all 31 of these entities directly with the new national innovation pillars. Where there is overlap, they need to be consolidated to ensure the entire apparatus is pulling the flywheel in the exact same direction.
And finally, to ensure that the physical act of building these new technologies stays on shore, the report calls for the government to provide targeted production tax credits.
Crucial piece of the puzzle.
And this is where it all connects back to you, the listener.
Yeah.
Because you might be wondering, why should you care about the minutia of grant reform, or R&D tax thresholds, or ASIC regulations?
That sounds a bit dry, yeah.
Right. But because if these structural reforms work, it shifts the entire foundation of the national economy. It means the high-skilled, high-paying jobs in advanced manufacturing remain in your local communities. It stops the cycle of local geniuses fleeing offshore the second their idea becomes viable.
It creates a self-sustaining ecosystem, an environment where a complex technology can be born in a specialized domestic university, funded by domestic superannuation, scaled through domestic tax incentives, purchased by the domestic government, and ultimately manufactured by local workers.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's kind of synthesize the core takeaways from the ambitious Australia report and the conversation's critique.
The fundamental mission is survival. Australia must abandon a risk-averse, highly fragmented funding system that relies entirely on exporting natural resources.
Yeah.
The blueprint demands a concentrated, flywheel-driven knowledge economy.
And to get there, the report suggests collapsing that maze of 150 scattered grants into 6 national innovation pillars governed by strict national strategic initiatives.
Right.
It demands protecting the blue sky research that invents things like Wi-Fi while allowing universities to specialize rather than generalizing. It pivots tax incentives away from stagnant small businesses and toward high-growth scale-ups.
And it incentivizes domestic PhDs with tax-free stipends, mandates that the government buys local tech first, and looks to unleash the trillion-dollar capital reserves locked within the superannuation system.
It is a deeply interconnected architectural overhaul. As the report concludes, adopting only convenient parts of this blueprint will serve as nothing more than a band-aid.
Yeah, without adopting the systemic changes, that projected 57% drop in living standards will simply become a reality.
It is a critical pivot point for an entire nation. But before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've talked entirely about Australia trying to catch up to the rest of the OECD. But consider this. If Australia actually manages to align its world-class foundational research with the multi-trillion-dollar war chest of its mandatory superannuation system, could they accidentally create a completely new model of nation building?
Oh, that's an interesting angle.
Right, one where the citizens' retirement funds directly own the technological breakthroughs of tomorrow. Imagine retiring on the dividends of the next Wi-Fi. What would that mean for how the rest of the world funds innovation?
That potential paradigm shift could completely redefine the relationship between a citizen's personal savings and a nation's technological future.
It really could. Well, thank you so much for exploring these sources with us today on The Deep Dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will catch you on the next one.